Welcome to the Competitive Enterprise Institute's online event entitled Who's Canning Competition? The FTC's Trip Down the Grocery Aisle. My name is Alex Reinauer. I'm a research fellow here at CEI, and I have the pleasure of moderating this event today with our esteemed panelists, who I will introduce in a moment. The Federal Trade Commission is currently taking a very close look at grocery markets. It is an election year, after all. It does appear that recent polling shows that inflation and grocery prices are at the forefront of American voters' minds. However, questions remain. Will the FTC's actions promote competition? And will those actions ultimately help or harm consumers? Fortunately, we have a panel that has been thinking a lot about this recently. I'm joined by Alden Abbott, Senior Fellow, Research Fellow at the Mercatus Center. Alden also previously served as General Counsel at the Federal Trade Commission. We also have Bryan Albrecht, who is Chief Economist at the International Center for Law and Economics. And finally, we are joined by Fred Ashton, Director of Competition Policy at the American Action Forum. Please join in today's discussion. We will take questions at the end of the hour from our guests online. Questions can be submitted in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen or by sending an email to events@cei.org. So just a quick roadmap for today. We're going to move, I think, more specific to general. We're going to start with the Albertsons Kroger merger. We'll ultimately use the FTC's report on supply chain as kind of a segue, and then round out the conversation with a discussion of the Robinson-Patman Act. So first, Kroger and Albertsons. This merger was announced October in 2022. The FTC ultimately filed to block the merger earlier this year in February. And I guess the first striking thing about the petition are the relevant markets. There's two of them. For the first one is supermarket, and I'd like to throw to Fred Ashton here to talk a little bit about the FTC's definition here. What kind of competitors they included, particularly what kind they excluded, and how does that kind of foreshadow how they're thinking about this merger?
Well, thank you, Alex, and thank you to CEI for hosting this event. I just want to take a step back and just explain to everyone who might not know what a relevant market is. And it's the lines of business where competition takes place. It generally includes two components, a product market and a geography. And it allows in this case, the FTC to identify the competitors and take measures of market concentration and other measures of market power. And Alex, as you said, the first relevant market identified in this claim are traditional supermarkets, which the FTC says offer a one-stop shopping experience where a grocer will have tens of thousands of items in stock in a variety of sizes, as well as a deep inventory, and also have a specific footprint size in terms of their brick and mortar stores. Now, the agencies exclude, or the FTC excludes, a lot of competitors that sell groceries, including wholesale clubs like Costco, smaller stores like Aldi, organic food stores like Whole Foods, dollar stores, and any e-commerce sales through things like Amazon Fresh. Now, the geography is pretty simple here. It's localized markets because most people will buy their groceries either at home or where they go to work. Now, the relevant market in this case really represents a static view of the grocery market and doesn't account for a lot of competitive changes that have happened over the last 30 years. The entry of wholesale clubs being an example. In 1997, 72% of grocery sales were made at a traditional supermarket. That number is now 54%. Costco and other super centers and wholesale clubs have moved from an 8% market share to over 22%. Now, that's a pretty substantial size of the market that the FTC is excluding. There are other issues with their market definition. Mail order and at-home delivery has increased from 3 to 9%. And it's interesting that while at the Open Markets Institute, FTC Chair Lena Khan identified consolidation in the grocery industry as a response to the entry of wholesale clubs. So it's a little suspect that they're now being excluded from that relevant market. Now, the case against Albertsons and Kroger does rely on the consumer welfare standard approach to antitrust enforcement. The FTC is concerned about rising prices, lower quality output, and fewer choices for the consumer.
Yeah, that's great, Fred. And it's really interesting with dollar stores in particular, because it's interesting how the FTC and their petitions focus on kind of the email exchanges or statements from the merging parties, but they don't really consider the statements from potential competitors. And I know dollar stores have been really expanding and expanding their offerings of fresh produce as well to become, as they've quoted, one-stop shops. So
Absolutely. And it's interesting that they specifically mentioned a store like Aldi, who has been the fastest growing supermarket chain in the country and plan to open, I believe, 800 new stores by 2025. So they're definitely a much larger competitor than the FTC gives them credit for.
Yeah, that's really great, Fred. Thank you. Next, I want to go to the more peculiar relevant market in this petition, and that has to do with union grocery labor. And I know, Bryan, you have been really talking about this a lot lately, and it was really important that we got you on the panel to discuss this. Can you kind of just give us an overview of these and just how interesting is it? How unique is this relevant market for union grocery labor?
Yeah. So just like Fred said, you have to kind of a word to describe it and then a geographic region. Here it's unionized grocery labor. So not all workers in those grocery stores. So even the competitors on the product market side, like a Walmart or something like that, their workers don't just overlap with the workers in the Kroger Albertsons case. And then it's the geographic region is by the collective bargaining agreement. So they already have in place certain collective bargaining agreements. Okay, that is kind of lumped together as a geographic region. Generally, it corresponds to kind of the city level, but it's not exactly that, and it varies again location by location. And that's one of the things that is so important in this merger is that lots of the discussion is kind of at the national level, but really a lot of the competition is happening locally, and so we kind of need to look a little local by local, or jurisdiction, city by city level, both on the product market and on the labor market side. It's a little bit of a strange. It's not strange that the FTC brought a labor challenge at some point. They've been signaling for a long time they wanted to do that. They included more explicit language in the merger guidelines about it. The union aspect of it is a little bit different. Wasn't exactly expecting that. It makes the labor market even more narrow than I would have expected. Because is it really that big of a difference for you to leave your union at Kroger and go to Walmart? Maybe not. That's the case that the FTC is going to have to make. The thing that I think is interesting is the alleged reason that they went for this particular market as kind of its own thing versus all grocery labor as a relevant market. They're trying to develop sort of a lock-in argument that you start in the union here, and then okay, right now you could move from Kroger to Albertsons, stay in the union, stay in all the benefits that you had from that union. But you still get the companies bidding off of each other. And so it's a little bit of the harm that's alleged is what I've been calling a bargaining theory, that it's really about now. It's not that there's fewer job prospects. It's not that they're going to hire fewer workers, which is the traditional market harm. The market harm that Fred was talking about in the product market is that you're going to restrict output. On the input market side, that means you're going to restrict input. That's not actually the harm that's alleged in the complaint. It's about that the companies are going to have a higher bargaining power over their workers. Okay, so that might seem like a subtle distinction or like kind of maybe even a distinction without a difference. But it really matters when you start looking at how these output markets and input markets correspond. And if it's just purely bargaining, like you just don't have as good options as a worker, I've argued in some places that that's actually going to increase product market output. That may be a good thing, maybe a bad thing, but traditionally, if a merger increases output, which I will think of that as a good thing, traditionally in antitrust, that's allowed through. So there's a little bit of a tension here. We'll see as the case develops how the FTC tries to deal with this, navigate this tension, but there is a tension there that I think will be worth watching.
Yeah, and is there something to be said that perhaps grocery labor is more aptly described as just kind of retail labor, that the kind of skills and experience you develop working at a grocery store can switch to something like Academy or a sporting goods store?
Yeah, this is one of the things about about most labor market cases that the FTC has considered, the DOJ have considered, the one exception being actually the author one that we can talk about with Penguin Random House. But most cases that people have talked about, the labor market is actually very large. So if you look at a product market side in a small town, expand the market as big as you want. There really are only a few, different spots where you can get groceries. Assume you're going to not get them delivered, right? Maybe we can dispute whether they should be 2, 3, 4, but like we could count them all. You go to any single town, we could just count the plausible ones. Labor markets are very different than that. When you look at plants that shut down, it's just not true that most workers go to a competitor. They go all over the place, okay? Both within the industry, geographically they move, okay? But most of them leave the industry overall because the industry is not their skill. Their skill is not, stocking grocery shelves. The skill is showing up on time, stocking shelves overall, being organized, so then they can maybe go work in a distribution center, things like that. So labor market is a much more wide-ranging market, and I think that's very relevant here to the extent you're going to allege a harm. Because, okay, yes, Kroger and Albertsons merge. Let's, for the sake of argument, say that means there's going to be fewer workers in grocery labor, okay? But if everyone can just go to Walmart because they're in a different, not Walmart, something that's not grocery, let's say Target, which isn't heavily grocery, right? Then that doesn't matter that Kroger and Albertsons merge. So this fact of the labor markets, you seem to have a lot more competitors for workers, and kind of wage rates are determined much more broadly, especially in these kind of general skills. We're not talking super specialized. We're not talking, a certain subclass of specialist doctors, or in the Penguin Random House case, we're not talking about Stephen King here. We're talking about very general set of workers that their kind of movement options are much broader than these two companies.
Yeah, thank you for that, Bryan. It's illuminating. Finally, before we talk about maybe the effects of this merger, I want to bring in Alden Abbott and really talk about the divestitures and the kind of offering up Albertsons and Kroger's seem to be bending over backward to kind of make this merger work. So Alden, while also giving us kind of context on how the FTC has previously handled these kind of grocery mergers, can you contrast that with kind of how they're handling this one, and why maybe the FTC is so unwilling to settle this merger?
Right. Well, thanks, Al. Shortly after the beginning of the Biden administration, the FTC and the Justice Department announced that they were going to litigate a lot more mergers. They did not. Justice Department says, we are not going to take settlements. We're going to litigate. The FTC hedged a bit, said, well, we want you to take care of things up front before you come to us with a merger proposal. We want all that taken care of. We don't want to litigate a fix of a proposal. We don't want to bear that risk, so-called litigating the fix. However, courts, what does it meant by litigating the fix? Is the agency says, the FTC says, well, this is anti-competitive in these local markets, but the competitors say, look, and as in this case, for example, Kroger and Albertsons, for a year and a half, we had been talking to a very successful wholesaler that also owns 150 stores, retail stores, CNS wholesalers, about buying up a bunch of stores where there are overlaps in local markets. And court, we think that these purchases would take care of almost all of the areas where there's direct competition in local markets. So we don't, and what would a court do with that? Well, despite what the agencies have said, if emerging partners well in advance have described a fix, and it seems plausible, the court will ask, would this fix actually solve the problem of a likely substantial lessening in competition in local markets? And if it would, they'd say, okay, where's the problem? Agency, you cannot ignore the fact that there's this fix, which is what the FTC was sort of saying. The FTC has said, well, we don't like this fix because, look, in 2014, when Albertsons acquired Safeway, and we're both actually the third and fifth largest retailers. Albertsons was the fifth, actually. And there was this divestiture of some stores to a company called Hagen. And Hagen actually, a year later, went bankrupt. The stores were badly managed. There was poor promotion by the stores. And however, that's perhaps the exception that proves the rule. This company had managed just a small number, 15 or fewer stores. It didn't have a strong track record, didn't have a kind of broad management experience with over 150 stores, plus a huge wholesale component that CNS does. So the companies can say, look, you had one bad fix. And by the way, let's look at the history. Historically, the FTC has allowed huge number of supermarket transactions to proceed with divestitures, including Ahold Delhaize, we already met Price Chopper Tops and lots. And actually, there's a study of divestitures carried out by the FTC, merger remedy study from 2006 to 2012, 89 orders, has found out the vast majority of divestitures actually succeeded in maintaining competition in affected markets. It wasn't perfect, but overall, well over 80% of orders were examined, met the goal of fully maintaining competition. Again, not perfect. But again, you need to look at the fact since 2022, when they started talking about that, the agencies describe Kroger and Albertsons described in great detail their relationship with CNS and how that would proceed. Contrast that again with a one really bad botched case, the Hagen case, where there was no real management agreement or plan on a promotional plan. So I think, very frankly, the FTC is in a weak position to say that, oh, you'd have to fix it first. This looks like a bad divestiture. The facts don't seem to support that.
Yeah, and I want to talk about the divestments also, but very briefly, there are kind of, as a fiduciary of tax dollars, right, there are kind of financial benefits, cost-saving benefits to settling as well, right?
Correct. No, absolutely, because the presumption is in horizontal merger, why don't you bar all of them? Well, because there's a certain degree of efficiency to be achieved. Indeed, there are efficiencies of also vertical integration as a side aspect of this horizontal merger, but there's ability to exercise some bargaining leverage, yes, but also to improve, management of the stores, to bring about all sorts of efficiencies, perhaps to reallocate resources within the chain. And this could lead to really benefits to consumers in terms of lower prices if it's allowed to go forward. And you're sacrificing all those potential benefits, which are substantial because of a theoretical risk that the divestiture isn't perfect.
Yeah, and I think that's all just particularly relevant right now. I think the FTC is currently testifying, trying to to get an increased budget as well.
And Alex, if I could just mention one thing to piggyback off of Alden. The FTC, I believe, identified 17 markets of concern in the complaint, and the divestitures offered by Albertsons and Kroger cover all 17 of those markets.
Right. And yeah, actually, a number of stores, at first there were 400 and some stores offered up, and 579 stores that would have been purchased by CNS and a few other stores too. So yes, this was something that well over a year, the parties described in particularity why these sales to reputable firm that had a plan would fix the situation in local markets where there were any concerns. And that's even assuming there were concerns. Some of these local markets were not necessarily that concentrated.
Right.
I say just to overcome those concerns, we are going to ensure that we don't have a real loss of competition of a competitor in all these local markets you seem to be concerned with.
Yeah,
Can I hop in here
sure.
quick? So maybe it's worth saying like why these divestitures, we see them in a lot of different industries, and Alden quoted or pointed to the figures from the retrospective, but why they're particularly relevant in kind of the retail sector is there's this disconnect between these conversations about, how big are these companies overall? They're the 9th biggest, the 4th biggest, whatever it is. Okay. And the way that competition actually happens, which is locally. So if you just put up a map of where these companies are, there's very little overlap on the east side of the country. Okay. They're operating in different regions. Neither of them are actually in Minnesota where I live. But it's certain particular cities in the West that we have some overlap. And so the question is, suppose there's one city in which they overlapped and everything else was different. Should we block the whole merger? I think reasonable people would say no. Figure out a solution to that one city. In this case, it's more than one city. And so that's why they have 579 stores that they're offering up. Now, is that every market? I need to go through line by line to figure that out. But it's a starting point. It's not, as Alden said, kind of a last minute, oh, we're in court already, I'm going to throw together a package. This is like a very detailed one. Which cities are left that the FTC is concerned about, both on the product market side and on the labor market side? Because our concern about mergers is, right, that these are no longer competitors. But if we're in a small town where right now there's only a medium-sized town where right now there's only a Kroger and an Albertsons, and you're worried, okay, they merge, now you'll have one company, there'll be kind of no competition for this particular town. Well, then the parties presumably would be open to divest, but we need to know, and this is something that I would never know, but you need to know exactly which cities are causing problems. The complaint has them at the city level, right. But we don't know, okay, if we're worried about these two stores being close to each other, well, let's divest one of them and then move on, which seems to be what Kroger and Albertsons are really adamant to do, because again, there's so much else, so many other parts of the country that there's no overlap, and therefore, at least traditionally, no competitive concerns. We could argue about possible other ways, but the way the complaint is written, there's no concern either, because we have narrow geographic regions in which we have concern about competition.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I wanted to just point out one thing about, the FTC has said, has viewed CNS Grocery as kind of an inadequate divesting partner. CNS Grocery, I think, is one of the largest private companies in the country. It's not a private equity, held firm. It's I think it's family owned, family run. So I'd like to talk get a little bit into the merger guidelines as well, right? Because I think a lot of us has been saying that this is one of the big horizontal tests of it. So I'll just give a very brief point to everybody to talk about either the kind of the vertical component with the divestiture plan, or the horizontal component, and to what extent is the FTC really testing their merger guidelines here? Just very briefly, everyone.
Right. They're certainly going to be testing their new structural presumption thresholds that were outlined in the merger guidelines. So the level of concentration to be considered highly concentrated went from 2,500 HHI to 1,800 HHI, and the change in that level was decreased, I believe, from 200 to 100. The FTC mentions this these thresholds were exceeded in a number of markets that they identified. And it's just another pattern of the FTC sort of conflating market concentration with market power. There are plenty of highly concentrated markets, I think, especially retail, where the competition is fierce. A small number of players does not mean competition gets any less intense than it would be with dozens or thousands of participants. And they also mention there's a guideline 7 and 8, which is a trend towards concentration and serial acquisitions. The FTC's complaint goes through the dozens of acquisitions made between Kroger and Albertsons over the last 20 years as an effort to expand rather than grow organically. They allege that they expanded their market reach through acquisition, and just in general, the retail grocery market has become slightly more concentrated over the last 20 years or so. So those are two of the big tests. Will those theories and structural presumptions be accepted by the courts?
Yeah, and that kind of answers a question from one of our viewers. Howard asked, one argument raised by the FTC is that consolidation drives up prices. So Alden or Bryan, if you want to expand upon that and touch on the merger guidelines, please go ahead.
Well, I will defer to Bryan a second. I'll just mention quickly, though, again, going back to market definition, this trend towards concentration ignores the dynamic changes in the industry, that the growth of all these specialized grocers says that, the hypermarkets, the Costco's and so on, would have expanded. Walmart and the clubs and Walmart's, their expansion, online purchases, all these dynamic changes offer new opportunities to consumers. And they seem to be fixated on this very traditional idea of a very narrowly defined retail supermarket. And again, that raises a big market definition question. I'd just like to quickly throw in something different, though. United Food Workers Union, believe it or not, Local 555, this was in Washington State, said it supported a merger between Kroger and Albertsons after having met with CNS. They said grocery is a business of constant change, but our members want their working conditions to be maintained, retirement secure. CNS understands the grocery business and wants to bring its fresh perspective to the Pacific Northwest. The financial gurus and spreadsheet warriors often forget that customers want friendly service, and they go into great length about the capabilities of CNS. So I think that is something that undoubtedly might be raised at trial.
Bryan, anything to add?
There's a lot of things I want to respond to. First to the question about consolidation. Absolutely, one of the concern is that the main mechanism by which the agencies, FTC, is worried about mergers, because at least the consolidation, those two companies are no longer competing with each other, and therefore that's what drives up prices. But I think we should keep our eye on the ball, that the concern is the higher prices, not the consolidation itself. And as Fred pointed out earlier, the complaint is good about this in the sense that it's talking about higher prices as the harm. We can dispute market definitions and whatnot, but the FTC takes a very traditional consumer welfare approach here. So the question is, will this particular consolidation, because it is a consolidation nationally and in the markets in which the merger goes through, put the divestiture stuff aside, will that lead to higher prices? Okay, and this is why we're talking about, okay, who's in the relevant market? So I write a newsletter. If I define the market as economics newsletters, okay, and me and another newsletter decide to join forces, are we going to be able to charge more? There's more consolidation in the market economics newsletters, but do we have any market power there? And that's where the dispute comes down to, and where we define the market matters. I argue no. And so that's why it's relevant in the Kroger Albertsons case to think about who are the relevant competitors here? Who else is going to be putting constant pressure? All else equal, yes, the merger allows companies to raise prices. How much, and what are going to be the forces pushing against that? And that's why Fred and Alden have been pointing towards the changing nature of things. We have to now think about Aldi and Costco and companies like that. So, this is the heart of the dispute. One thing I would add is that there is a little tension on the way that I think about it, and I'm pointing out my own flaws. So I'm a little bit skeptical of the labor market claim because we've never seen a claim like this before. It seems very narrow. But at the same time, I'm a little bit annoyed of how the product market was defined because they use the same one as they used for the last 30 years, which is this traditional supermarket stuff, and is not accounting for the changes. And so I don't know how to square that yet. I gotta think about that. I think there's a trade-off. We need to think about how these markets are changing, but at the same time, we need to be grounded in previous cases. So there's interesting tensions there that I think we need to. People who are thinking about these markets need to take seriously.
Yeah, that's really great, guys. I know a lot of people are watching this merger closely, being the really first big horizontal merger that the FTC is going to be challenging under its new guidelines. I'm a little biased here. I won the Easter egg hunt that Albertsons hosted on the frozen food aisle as a child, so I really have fond memories of that.
Alex, can I actually say one more thing on that?
Sure.
Sorry to interrupt. So
about Easter egg hunts or about groceries?
Yeah, a big Easter egg hunt. No, about the merger guidelines. This is the other part that just quickly. So I think there's two parts to the merger guidelines to think about. One is broad signaling of what the agencies think are important, and what are actual requirements that have been met. So the merger guidelines make explicit that they're going to go after labor markets, more explicit than previous guidelines. And so in that sense, it is testing the merger guidelines. The merger guidelines also make structural presumptions and concentration measures more central, even forget the levels, just the structural presumption more central. And so that way it's testing the merger guidelines. But I need to go back and look at this. I think the case would have still been brought under the old merger guidelines. I don't think there's that many of the jurisdictions that are between the 200 delta of the the old merger guidelines and the new ones. A lot of these we're talking about going the ones that there's a concern about well over these thresholds. So whether the guidelines are here or there, and there's the 2010 or the 2023, that's really not important. I think it's a test of the broad focus that these guidelines put forward for the agencies.
That's great. And I guess when we're talking about groceries, another big discussion is supply chain. So I want to bring Fred in here because he's written a lot about the FTC's recent report on grocery supply chains. Can you talk about the report? What does it mean for competition in groceries, and ultimately, what is this? Is there any illustration of how the FTC is using economics for these 12B studies?
This 6B study from the FTC was very disappointing. 6B allows the FTC to get inside information from some of the industry's biggest participants. In the grocery or the supply chain study, the FTC requested documents from 3 of the largest retailers, 3 of the largest wholesalers, and 3 of the largest suppliers. But when it came to writing the report, it's as if the FTC locked the economists out of the room. There was no economic analysis using the requested data. They relied heavily on public information, including I know Bryan's written about this, a fairly bad measure of margins. And it didn't really discuss the competitive aspects both horizontally and vertically that the supply chain disruptions had on competition. The FTC was very good at pointing out different business models, which is a form of competition that differed among companies at various stages of the supply chain, but they didn't measure whether or not one company increased their prices more than their input costs compared to the rest of the industry, compared to companies of like size, and how that differed. They only focused on large corporations and did nothing to measure the general competitive atmosphere in grocery supply chains.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting that they, in addition to Kroger being one of the companies they studied, they also included C&S Grocery as someone to study. I thought that was really funny.
Complete chance.
Yeah, Alden,
Right.
Bryan, anything to talk about this study, or just generally how the FTC has been treating economics in 6B studies?
Yeah, so I completely agree with what Fred said there. I think one way to crystallize it is throughout the report, there's a lot of things about these are big companies, these are consolidated markets, this bad thing happened. There's no counterfactual. So in economics, you always just say, okay, some markets are concentrated, some markets aren't concentrated. Were the concentrated markets, hurt more than the others? We have no comparison group here. It's just something bad happened, and these are big companies because that's who they asked for. Therefore, the big is bad, and there's no real comparison group there. So I think that's part of what Fred means when the economists are locked out of the room. The economists, it's all about trying to create counterfactuals. Let's try to find the right matching between these companies versus that one, because there's nothing in the report. Put away all the complaints about the data and whatnot. There's nothing in the report that says that these companies had any more of an impact than any other companies, because they don't have that data. They don't have any way of looking at it. And so that was fairly frustrating to see.
Alden, anything last to add?
I don't think so. I think it's already been said. I think that more generally speaking, there seems to be a real downplaying in these reports, 6B reports of economic analysis, and I think there's another one came out just today on PBMs, but there seems to be a trend in my view.
That's right. The one on PBMs that came out this morning, Commissioner Holyoke, that was the whole point of her dissent, was a lack of economic evidence and support to make the claims that were voted upon.
All right.
Yeah, and Fred, if you could just segue, because in your writing about this report, you talk a lot about Robinson-Patman Act. So it's a 1936 kind of anti-price discrimination statute. Has been seldomly enforced, particularly recently. If you could just give us a short intro into what the Robinson-Patman Act is and kind of how the FTC is looking at it.
The supply chain study was written to give the FTC the opportunity to enforce Robinson-Patman. It discussed how companies of a large size can use their leverage to demand discounts, which the Robinson-Patman Act deems illegal. So Robinson-Patman, like you said, is a Depression-era law that was written in response to really a populist movement against large chain stores, specifically A&P, which no longer exists today. And the allegations were A&P, because of their size, could demand steep discounts. They were able to cut out the middleman and go directly to the supplier, something your local mom and pop shop couldn't do. And it was putting a lot of mom and pop shops out of business. So that group went to Congress, and Congress passed the Robinson-Patman Act. And for the last, I believe it's 30 years, the agencies have only brought 2 federal cases. There have been private litigation at the state level, but in terms of federal enforcement, it's been very limited. And it's because it runs counter to what most antitrust law really focuses on, which is consumer welfare. There's a lot of people believe increased enforcement in Robinson-Patman will result in higher prices.
Yeah, and also, there's this focus with the Robinson-Patman Act that they're really protecting competitors and not consumers. But I want to bring in Alden, because he's also done a lot of work on this and on how it affects kind of smaller and medium-sized firms. So Alden, can you talk about how maybe this reinvigorated enforcement could have some counterproductive effects on that end?
Right. Well, it's interesting. There's been a study of Robinson-Patman Act cases, a number of them, of actual cases brought. And many of these cases were bread and butter FTC cases in the 50s and 60s and even into the 70s. And there's a showing that a large number of small and medium-sized businesses were targets themselves because, again, focus on the fact that most of these are private actions. The FTC brought cases, but it was private businesses can enforce the antitrust laws. So you had some medium-sized firms or even relatively small firms that somehow managed to get a discount and they're certainly targets of a lawsuit. So that did not help the supposed small firms that was supposed to, and in some cases they ended up being losers as well. And the problem is that the act is very complicated. It has all of these meeting competition, cost-based offenses, but it's very, very complicated. And really, the larger firms are better able to afford legal counsel on the vagaries of Robinson-Patman Act than these smaller and medium-sized firms who had a hard, even experienced antitrust lawyers who don't do this have a hard time figuring out the case law. So this is really sort of a special interest law that went in the wrong direction. But perhaps it's not surprising the FTC is interested in this. Lena Khan wrote a law student note at Yale about the looking at Amazon and comparing it to the really A&P case, and she showed a lot of suspicion about discounts obtained to large firms. There's a lot that can be said about the Robinson-Patman Act, but as I said, it's so complex that it really losers often are smaller and medium-sized businesses, not just giant firms.
Yeah, it's really interesting, Alden, and I'd like to bring in Bryan to talk about kind of the economics of price discrimination. I know he's also thought and written a lot about this, and maybe touch on, what are the kind of the effects on consumer welfare on really enforcing this very antiquated statute.
Yeah, so one of the hard parts is, what is price discrimination versus just differential prices? Like, men tend to be charged less for their haircuts than women. Is that price discrimination, or is that different at time? It takes a long time for these locks, but I still pay the men's prices happily. So what happens there? So let's just take a step back and think about price discrimination. So from an economist's point of view, I don't know the details of, all the Robinson-Patman cases and what's been made, but from the economist's point of view, it's basically charging two prices to what are, from the firm's perspective, two similar customers. And there's no cost difference between them. I sell a sandwich to someone who's 40 years old. I sell a sandwich to someone who's 65 years old. I'm still making the same sandwich, but I'm going to charge a 65-year-old less money. That's price discrimination. Now, there's a downside to that economically, is that with different prices, you're not always allocating goods to the people who value it most, because there's going to be young people who value the sandwich more than that old person does, but because their price is higher, they won't get it. So that's the negative side of price discrimination. And there's a cost involved with it's hard sometimes to enforce that as the seller, that you're trying, you have to check IDs if you're going to do that. Okay. But there's a beneficial side too, and that is that it lowers prices for the 65-year-old, right? You could always set the high price for everyone, but overall, what you're doing is you're selectively picking out people to lower the price to. You could say that it's selectively raising the price for other people, but that's not how the math works out. You're always lowering the price for the next person. You're trying to sell one more to someone else, and therefore you're lowering the price for them. And that can be good and bad, and there's situations in which it's good and bad. And it's an empirical and a theoretical question of when that happens. But I think kind of the blanket skepticism of price discrimination is not justified by economic theory or economic evidence, okay? Because there's sometimes good, sometimes it's bad, but the Robinson-Patman Act doesn't really give any way of distinguishing those. And so that's why I think that's one of the major reasons that, The Antitrust Modernization Committee or whatever it was called, bipartisan group of experts on this said we should repeal the Robinson-Patman Act. It's incoherent, and it at times fundamentally contradicts the other goals of antitrust, which is to lower consumer prices.
Yeah, it's awesome. Thanks for that analysis, Bryan. We're heading into our last 15 minutes of this, so I want to look at the questions and see if we can pull a few. We have one from Rob regarding Albertsons and Kroger's talking about profit margins. It seems like profit margins for groceries are pretty small. They're not extravagant, really large profit margins. And I think looking particularly at Kroger and Albertsons, Kroger I think has even smaller profit margins. So I think there's a lot of thinking that that kind of focus on lesser prices are going to permeate through kind of the Albertson stores as well. So just generally, what are the chances that this merger are going to lower prices for consumers?
That's the $1 million question. I think of the kind of more basic thing that we need to think about is that the future isn't today. So we're not comparing like the market as it exists today to like keeping that market stagnant, in the future. These markets are always changing, some markets more than others, but in grocery, it seems to be quite dynamic in that sense, like more technology being involved, more options being available. I mean, I just think about relative to even when I was a kid, I'm not that old, just there's more stuff on the shelf. There's more options through ordering online. Some of the stuff that maybe it made it coherent to talk about the traditional supermarket back in 1992 is not the same thing today. Like I can just get groceries from Aldi and then get my, home supply or my toiletries and stuff from Amazon. And that changes the dynamic of the market. But the question about, thin margins, it is evidence of tough competition. The economist me has to push back and say, accounting profits are not the same thing as economic profits, and so they could be masking something. But it is a sign that there's not huge, just extraction happening by these companies. I guess the FTC would always push back and say, right now it's not that case, but after the merger, now profit margins are going to soar, yada, yada, yada. I think when you have low margins for decades across lots of different business platforms and stuff, that's not a strong argument, but people can make it.
Another question from Bernard. What is the history of antitrust challenges where the competitive harm is labor prices? So I think, Alden, you may have been saying something about this before, but if you could expand a little bit.
Right. Well, in these markets, an input to cost is obviously labor costs. So in one sense, when the FTC is saying, well, you're not going to get the bargaining of union workers, at one company that you used to threaten to go to the other company, that seems perhaps a dubious credibility, even if you credited it. What you're saying is that now, and by the way, the companies that we're not going to reduce these union jobs, and even CNS has said that, but that what they're saying is that you would be lowering input costs from labor is a bad thing. Well, as was suggested, why can't union workers? They can go elsewhere in non-grocery jobs, other retail jobs. But if you're lowering costs, that could be translated into lower prices for consumers. So again, on the one hand, as Bryan pointed out, this is the meat of the complaint is a consumer welfare standard saying that direct competition for consumers is going to raise price. But here you're concerned that somehow because of a change in bargaining leverage, the price of labor is going to go down, and that means that would tend to lower prices. So there's an internal contradiction, I would argue, in their complaint. And So I that's a very peculiar thing. It's not the traditional idea of monopsony, where we're going to reduce the number of units of labor we're buying, and that's going to harm them, and it's actually going to raise prices eventually. No, they're openly saying that this bargaining leverage business would tend to lower cost of labor, which would benefit consumers.
Yeah, that's a more eloquent way of saying what I was trying to say earlier, this tension between lowering costs versus lowering how much you hire. Lowering how many workers you hire means you're going to produce less, which means that you're going to be able to raise prices on the product market side. You get opposite outcomes there. The most directly relevant, I think it's the only case, I should be more confident about that. On labor market side, it was the one I hinted at before, Penguin Random House trying to merge with Simon & Schuster, or maybe it was acquired, I forget the legal nature of it. But two big publishing companies, and the product market, the case was brought by the DOJ. The market was authors with large advances, which would be $250,000 advances. So it's a small market on the labor side. But the way that they were focusing on the labor side, both sides granted that if there was harm on the labor side, it would mean fewer books. And so there wasn't a tension in that case. It was a traditional monopsony, traditional in the economic theory sense. It's what economic theory says is monopsony. Yeah. If after this merger there's going to be fewer advances of $250,000 or more, then there will be fewer books. And so they kind of said, okay, the easiest way to solve the product market side, or to learn about the product market side, is to look at what incentives it creates for the authors, and then all the dispute is over there. And the court ruled with the DOJ that the merger would harm those authors. But so that's a different case here than Kroger and Albertsons, where you have this tension. But that's kind of where we are right now. And I think one of the reasons that's all we have is because most cases tend to look like the book the book merger, the publishing merger, because if you're hiring fewer workers, you're going to produce less. And so there's not this kind of opposite forces. And so if you can bring the case, like suppose I granted that there was a market for grocery workers, okay? Just put aside the union stuff, okay? It's going to be easier to show the harms on the consumer side. And so why do I need to show the worker side? Because if I'm harming consumers, I'm also going to help harm workers, because as I said before, the markets are the same, except on the worker side, you also have all those retail markets that Alex mentioned. That's also where you go. So the easier case for the agencies to bring is the product market side. And so that's what they've traditionally done. It's not that it's in any way against the idea of antitrust to bring these labor cases. They're perfectly reasonable. It's just usually there's not tension here.
Yeah, and just so we're coming in our final minutes, so I just want to get big picture here, right? The title of this panel, this webinar is, who's canning competition? So I want to give everyone a final 1-minute word on this, on what is the likelihood of FTC's continued interest in grocery markets? Are these actions more likely to harm or help consumers? I'm going to start, just 1 minute each. Start with Fred.
This is by no means the end for the Biden administration or the FTC's interest in grocery markets. The Biden administration is very concerned with grocery price inflation, and this is a way the administration's trying to attack any further rise in food at home prices. Whether it's justified or not, this is going to be the tactic, and they're going to use the grocery supply chain study to further any Robinson-Patman Act cases. And this complaint, I believe, will be litigated. It will not be settled. The FTC is not satisfied with any of the divestiture proposals. And it could eventually harm consumers in the end by preventing two companies that are trying to compete in a very competitive environment from the efficiencies that they could gain through a merger.
Awesome. Alden, 1 minute.
Okay, I basically agree. Fred basically said what I would have said, but this is all part of a bigger I think Biden administration whole of government approach to competition, in particular to labor markets. The FTC is with the National Labor Relations Authority, Labor Department. There's been an emphasis dating back to executive order on competition, on concern about labor markets. So I think it's whatever happens in this case, and don't have a magic crystal ball. It looks as if the FTC is going to try to continue to bring in labor market counts, partly because I think philosophically they want to enhance union bargaining power, and they view that as an important thing. So we will see what happens, but it's part of a bigger story.
And Bryan, you get the last word.
Oh boy, a lot of pressure. Yeah, I think that's the right way to think about it, that it's part of a broader push, for good or bad. Like, if you think it's a good thing, it's a broader push by the administration on competition, but in particular competition related to grocery stores and the whole supply chain related to that. I tend to be skeptical. I think that a lot of this is trying to make a boogeyman that isn't there. All this talk about greedflation and price gouging, and right, the 6B report started out as like the press release was all about a price gouging. When you go to the final report, there's nothing really. It's not price gouging. It's a whole different thing. So it's trying to smuggle in this political language, this shaming of the other in a way that I think is antithetical to the, for good or bad, technocratic aspect of antitrust. Antitrust is a question about, will prices rise? Will wages rise? These types of things, not about whether we label something price gouging, which has no empirical bite to it. So I'm worried that a lot more of the grocery store, the whole grocery market work, whether it's more cases, whether it's more studies, a lot of it is really going to be about political sound bites and not about sound antitrust and economic analysis.
Awesome. Well, we have a lot to look forward to, and I look forward to reading and seeing all of your work on this in the future, at least for the next year. Thanks to everyone for joining us, especially our panelists, Alden, Bryan, Fred. This has been really fun. We have a special project at CEI called Eye on FTC, where we feature and cite to everyone's latest work on the Federal Trade Commission, and Alden, Bryan, and Fred are often on there, and we love to feature their work. So, but please take a moment to fill out an online survey and let us know what you think about today's program. We really value your feedback, and it's super important. So, thanks to everyone involved. Thank you for joining us, and we really hope you enjoyed this panel.